surpassed 2.5 million globally, and the United States continues to rank highest in both the number of fatalities and infections. For weeks on end, countless essential workers have organized walkouts, sick-outs, sit-ins, picket lines, and other forms of protest to protect what is most essential to them, their lives. We stand with all workers amidst this crisis. We'll hear more about these actions later on in the program, but we're going to start off with 2 short videos from members who will tell us why they joined the PSL. Then we'll have reports from 3 members and branches that are engaged and struggles to elevate the demands in their cities. Lastly, we'll hear from 2 speakers from our party's central leadership to speak to us about the growth of anti-Chinese racism brought on by the corporate media's coverage of the coronavirus and the April 25th National Day of Car Protest to demand a cancellation of all rents for the duration of the pandemic. And then we'll close with a Q&A segment. You can find out more information about the Day of Protest and see what actions are being organized near you by visiting canceltherents.org. Now we're going to begin our program in just a moment, but before we do, I'd like to ask that everyone watching right now take a moment and share these live streams on your social media pages and help our message reach more people. Thank you. Our program will begin with 2 pre-recorded videos on why these comrades joined. We will hear first from Ruth. Ruth is an organizer with the PSL in Florida.
I joined the PSL, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, at a time in my life after I had spent countless hours volunteering for different candidates, protesting, and doing community organizing. I remember my excitement in 2008. I was voting for the first time, and I was voting for Obama. I also remember the heartbreak that came after. I had to spend the majority of his presidency protesting for change, advocating for different issues. It felt no different than when we were under our Republican government. I remember feeling hopelessness, as if, we are actually the victims of a political system where the will and vote of the people is not respected. Every 4 years, we had to make the decision of voting for the less of the 2 evils. And I just rejected that idea. I realized that we will never have liberation on this source system and that we actually need a change. Years after that, I began talking and learning more from other members of the party. I began learning more about socialism, how society is actually organized under socialism, and how socialism addresses the needs of people. It's a society that's actually organized to meet the needs of people and not just to put money in the pockets of millionaires. I joined the Party for Socialism and Liberation because it is an alternative to the craziness that we have in the political system today.
The next video features Adon. Adon is an organizer with the PSL in California.
Hello, my name is Adon. I'm an organizer with the Party for Socialism and Liberation here in Los Angeles, California. I joined the party in January of 2016. What really impressed me about the party was an action and solidarity with the Bolivarian Revolution of Venezuela in December of 2015. I had been before that an organizer for the Bernie Sanders 2016 presidential campaign. I was learning about the war on terror and the Vietnam War and all these different things that were happening around the world helped me piece together what the US empire had really been doing in just my lifetime. What really drew me into the party was the fact that there's so much discipline and patience of the comrades here that, they focused on my political education, giving me books and articles, checking in on me to see what I thought about those books and articles. And, on top of that, it was the fact that as soon as I became a candidate, I immediately began organizing for the La Riva presidential campaign of 2016 here in California. Additionally, the PSL was not organizing behind one single issue or one campaign, but the fact that we had a systemic framework where we wanted to depopularize capitalism and popularize socialism. Some of the work that I've been able to do here is, I've been able to engage in doing logistics for actions. For example, the September 2017 March and Rally in defense of DACA students that we organized here. Organizing our annual Noche Cubana fundraiser in solidarity with the Cuban Revolution. I've been able to do international liberationnews.org coverage of the refugee caravans in November of 2018. And on top of that, we've been able to organize, hands-off Venezuela tour here locally. We were able to get at least 9 different locations where our comrade Gloria was able to speak about their time in the early part of March in 2019 when the U.S. was trying to overthrow Venezuela. And so I hope folks thinking of, well, maybe I don't know enough about socialism, about organizing, or I'm new to political activism. Here in the PSL, you can be trained to become a revolutionary leader of our class, the working class, because we here in the PSL are organizing a new generation of revolutionaries to fight the battles in the future. So please join us today.
PSL is a rapidly growing socialist party comprised of people just like you. Our members are multinational, multi-generational, belong to different communities, and are united by a revolutionary political program and the need to transform society to meet the needs of the majority. We believe in a right to free universal healthcare, the right to a quality job, the right to decent housing, and a free education. It is the everyday poor and working people who are the ones should be bailed out of this crisis and not Wall Street or the big corporations. We believe that many of society's injustices are directly tied to the unjust capitalist system, and that the real solution to these problems has to begin with the overthrow of capitalism. If you're interested in learning more about becoming involved in helping build the revolutionary socialist movement in the United States, we urge you to consider joining the PSL today. You can visit pslweb.org/join to fill out an application. To stay up to date on the work of the PSL, you can also follow us on social media at PSL Web and read our daily analysis of pressing struggles at liberationnews.org. Before we move on to our next segment, I want to ask everyone watching now to take a moment to share this live stream on your social media if you haven't already, to help us share our message and reach a larger group of people. Now we will hear from 3 PSL organizers from branches that have been involved in actions to elevate the demands in their cities. First, I would like to introduce Claudia. Claudia is an organizer with the PSL in Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome, Claudia.
Hello, comrades. Near, far, and wherever you are, sending you all warm wishes of health, safety, and solidarity. And a special thanks to our comrades who have been with us for years, decades, and even those newer comrades who are awakening during this crisis and realizing their moment to join the struggle. Thank you all. And comrades, these are unprecedented times. Within just a few short weeks, we have seen our lives completely uprooted. We are witnessing the contradictions of capitalism in real time and its devastating effects on our class, the working class, the essential class. Millions of people have lost their jobs and are struggling now more than ever to put food on the table, a roof over their heads, and a future on the horizon. There is a growing anxiety among people in this country. However, the federal government wants to avoid any criticism and refuses to take responsibility. The Trump administration has given us a pittance payment of a one-time $1,200 direct deposit. Now, $1,200 barely covers rent for a majority of people, and that's if you qualify for it. Unfortunately, undocumented people are barred from receiving any of this so-called relief. People who are undocumented make up a large block of the essential workers who are out there on the front lines continuing to make our society run. While there is no work, there is no pay. We cannot put profits over people's lives. That is why the PSL is calling for a national day of car caravan actions, demanding that people's rents be canceled, as well as mortgage payments for homeowners and small businesses. It's too early to send people back to work and to so-called reopen the economy. Here in Georgia, where I live, Governor Brian Kemp has stated that he will send people back to work as early as next week. He says he's worried about people being able to put food on the table. But if he's that much of a bleeding heart, shouldn't he just provide the food instead of making workers risk their lives? Risking lives in order to make a profit for the big businesses? It is an insult to workers everywhere to insist that we go back to work when we know that it's dangerous. Until COVID-19 passes, we demand that rents be canceled and debt forgiven. We demand that resources are redistributed to the people who are hurting the most under this outbreak. Click to find out about a car caravan happening near you, and if you don't see one, organize one. Safety and resources to you.
Thank you, Claudia. Next, I would like to introduce Lillian. Lillian is an organizer with the PSL in Denver, Colorado. Welcome, Lillian.
Hi, my name is Lillian, and I'm an organizer with the Denver branch of the PSL. We've been organizing with a coalition of groups for this Saturday's National Day of Car Protests to cancel the rents. We will meet up in the Mercury Cafe parking lot at 3:30 p.m. and then drive in a rolling caravan to key spots in the city that exemplify our three demands. The first demand, of course, is rent cancellation. The extent of what the Colorado government has done to protect renters in this crisis is to nicely ask police, banks, and landlords to exercise leniency with evictions until April 30th, which is 4 days from now. Without rent cancellation, an estimated 450,000 people are expected to be evicted across Colorado when evictions resume in full force. That is nearly 8% of the entire state population. Many, many more will have to sacrifice other necessities to scrape up the money to continue making rent and stay in their homes. Without rent cancellation, once the coronavirus eases up, the people of Colorado will only be facing another kind of crisis. Our second demand is that the government seize vacant housing to provide shelter for people who are homeless, living in overcrowded conditions, or are medical or essential workers who need a place to rest without fear of endangering their families. Today marks 1 full month that Colorado has been under a stay-at-home order, and still state and local governments have failed to make provisions for the thousands of people across the state who do not have homes in which to shelter. In Denver, there are at least 4,000 people who don't have homes, and yet the shelter system can only accommodate a maximum of 2,000 people under normal conditions. Meanwhile, some 152,700 housing units, or 6.3% of all housing units in the state, are sitting empty year-round. PSL Denver has identified just 10 apartment complexes in downtown Denver that together have vacancies totaling 1,217 units. Unsurprisingly, these vacancies are heavily concentrated in the luxury complexes, which most of the city's people can't afford. Opening this housing to people in need could house 2,750 people immediately, with 1 person per room, allowing for safe distancing practices. This means that the vacancies in just these 10 buildings could accommodate the entire capacity of the Denver shelter system, plus 750 additional people, and under far safer conditions. We are calling on the government to use this and other vacant housing, which is immediately ready to go, to meet the urgent needs of the people for safe shelter during this crisis. Our third demand is for the release of all ICE detainees and all vulnerable inmates, those convicted for low-level offenses and those who have not been convicted at all. Where people remain in incarceration, there must be a dramatic increase in medical staffing and supplies and guaranteed sanitary conditions for all inmates. For us here, this demand has particular relevance to the ICE detention center, which is located in our neighboring city of Aurora. 5 ICE employees at the for-profit Aurora Detention Center have tested positive for coronavirus, and an unknown number of detainees are being isolated for possible exposure to COVID-19. GEO has consistently demonstrated that it will not expend the resources to provide adequate medical care to detainees. Even under normal conditions, infectious disease outbreaks are routine at the facility. This center, like all places of incarceration in the United States, is a breeding ground for a catastrophic outbreak. Immigration is not a crime. It shouldn't be a death sentence. It is imperative that as we organize to demand what we need to survive from the government, that we include and we fight for all of our brothers and sisters. So if you're in Denver, we hope to see you 3:30 p.m. on Saturday at the Mercury Cafe.
Thank you, Lillian. Lastly, I would like to introduce Candace. Candace is an organizer with the PSL in Chicago, Illinois. Welcome, Candace.
Hi, my name is Candace, and I am a member of the Party for Socialism and Liberation located in Chicago. Here in Chicago, we are excited to announce that this Saturday we will be holding a car protest to demand the cancellation of rents. We are asking not just for rent to be held, not just a moratorium on evictions, but for the full cancellation of rents and mortgages, with no expectation that they be paid at some later date. Chicago's Albany Park neighborhood, where we have the PSL office, is one of the city's most diverse and working class, with a large immigrant community. It's one of the neighborhoods that exposes the inequalities that have long existed in our city, which is starkly divided along lines of race and class. For the past few weeks, we've been partnering with Centro Autonomo, an Albany Park Community Center, to make calls to the community and to learn from residents about their needs and concerns. Being able to pay rent has been the number one concern that we've heard. And that's not really surprising, because if we can't work, how are we expected to pay? This is especially the case for workers without papers who are shut off from even the crumbs of social assistance that the state is now offering. Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot recently signed an executive order promising that all immigrants in the city will be provided with COVID-19 relief. However, the extent of these resources remain unclear. That uncertainty is unacceptable at a time like this, and canceling rents and mortgages for all would be a very clear and unambiguous benefit to the community in this time. We know that these same concerns are widespread throughout the city, this state, and this nation. Communities of color have been especially hard hit by this crisis, especially where access to healthcare was already severely limited. Black and Hispanic Chicagoans make up over 70% of the COVID-19 deaths and cases in the city. And this is with Black and Hispanic people being tested at severely lower rates when compared to their white counterparts. A doctor at a major Chicagoland hospital unofficially reported that 90% of its ICU patients were Black or Hispanic. And this is further disturbing as mortality rates in ICUs are higher since the onset of the pandemic. These shocking prevalence rates reveal the city's long-term disinvestment in Black and brown communities. Chicago's jails have also become centers of the pandemic. A public health official unofficially reported that 35% of incarcerated people tested have tested positive for the virus. This is unacceptable, and we are not only demanding compassionate release for these prisoners and detainees, but also COVID-19 testing and isolation housing for those who need it. Earlier this week, we took part in a car protest demanding exactly that. And with this Saturday's action in Albany Park, we will continue to raise that demand, along with the cancellation of all rents and mortgages. We want to show the people that we are not just sitting back during this time, but that we are committed to being out there, in whatever form that must take now, to keep up the fight and to show the people that the struggle still continues. Thanks, and we'll see you in the struggle.
Thank you, Candace. For the past 2 months, essential workers have been standing up across the country to demand personal protective equipment and other action from their employers to protect themselves against infection of coronavirus. This strike wave is a response to the grotesque neglect from big corporations who care more about saving their bottom line than they do the lives of the workers who generate it. The scale of this wave hasn't been seen in decades. Over 1,000 collective actions nationwide have occurred since the beginning of March. And these are just some of the examples. These are just the ones that make it to the media. Some organizers are not seeking media attention to avoid retaliation. Many of the actions are taking place in unorganized workplaces and are therefore going unrecorded. But all this really speaks to the growing consciousness amongst workers in response to the dangerous conditions that they're being forced to endure. Much of the activity is centered in Chicago, New York, New Jersey, the Northeast, in Los Angeles and San Francisco. I want to highlight just a few instances across various industries where workers have begun to fight back. The first example I want to go to is poultry workers. In late March, workers at food processing plants in Illinois, Virginia, Colorado, Georgia walked out to protest unsafe work conditions. And on March 23rd, workers at Purdue Farms in Georgia walked out after being told by management to work more hours without a pay increase. They also walked out for increased worker protection after several workers at the plant tested positive. These workers want a promise to daily workplace sanitation, an increase in cleaning protocols, and more sick time, which is up to like 4 weeks, and for the workers who contract the virus so that they can stay home and quarantine themselves with pay. Another sector that I want to go to that has been organizing is the gig workers at the couriers. On March 30th, Amazon warehouse workers in Staten Island, New York, and Instacart grocery delivery workers nationwide walked off their jobs, demanding more PPE and pay as they continue to work. Other Amazon actions took place in Detroit and Chicago. As a product of this struggle, Instacart says it will begin distributing hand sanitizers to its workers. Fast food workers have also been organizing for protection. Fast food workers, delivery people, warehouse workers, and other food service workers have also organized protests across the country, demanding PPE, hazard pay, sick pay, and further action from their employers. At least 30 supermarket employees have died as a result of coronavirus. Another 3,000 have called out of work after showing signs of coronavirus-related illnesses. Thousands have protested, taken off, organized sick outs to press the companies to institute better safety procedures. On April 9th, 30 fast food workers walked out in California. The strike has also spread to some of the country's most well-known food giants. Factory workers too have been protesting. General Electric workers in New York, Dallas, Texas, Massachusetts, and Virginia have staged protests to demand that the company refit the plants to make desperately needed ventilators and other medical equipment. GE has responded with layoffs and is threatening to furlough a large part of its workforce. We salute these workers as they continue their struggle. Another sector that has been organizing is the transit sector. Recently, bus drivers in Detroit struck and won all of their demands, and fares will not be collected for the duration of the coronavirus crisis. These actions are just a few, but they really represent a glimpse of countless workers across the nation who are no longer tolerating being subject to essential worker mandates with disposable worker treatment. They highlight the vast willingness for so many sectors of our class to stand up against their employers and demand what they should already have as a right. And they highlight what is possible when we organize. This crisis delivered by the coronavirus pandemic is exposing the billionaire bosses who have no interest in providing that for which some could be the difference between life and death. It demonstrates that they will not provide what workers need to prevent infection on the job unless we fight for it. The relentless profit motive of the capitalist class and the desperate need of the working class to work in healthy conditions do not mesh. We are the ones who do all the work. We are the ones who make society run. The capitalists, particularly during this crisis, are making our lives very difficult. We do not need them. They are in the way. Surely, as these workers continue to struggle, more victories will follow, and hopefully what also follows is more urgency behind the need for working people to take control of society and seize power from the hands of those who are incapable of making decisions in the interest of the majority. Now, for the last portion of today's program, we're going to hear from two central leaders of the Party for Socialism and Liberation. First, I would like to introduce Sheila Shao. Sheila is a member of the Central Committee of the PSL who works as a research analyst. She is joining us from Los Angeles, California. Welcome, Sheila.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning in with us today, and thank you, Andrew. So today I will be discussing another aspect of our fight back, and as the COVID-19 crisis deepens in the US, increasing unemployment rates, housing instability, the crippling of an already impacted healthcare system, and with little to no clear direction from our federal government about how they intend to deal with the crisis, as well as the ramifications that have already impacted so many lives, the system is exposing itself for what it really is, right? So instead of adequately responding to the crisis, the US government is increasing anti-China bigotry. Corporate media continues to pump out racist headlines, pondering about how to hold China accountable for this pandemic, while the leader of this so-called free world, President Trump, referred to COVID-19 as the China virus. And this is not only racist, but has violent ramifications. This blame game simultaneously scapegoats China by diverting the attention of the American people away from the failures and mismanagement of the US government, while simultaneously whipping up anti-Chinese racism and hate, further justifying war and military aggression with China. And this should tell us something about the priorities of the government. The fact is, the lives of the people suffering because of this crisis under the bloodthirsty US imperialist system is not a priority. The government is scrambling for what feels like scraps to allocate for the people, while corporate CEOs and the ruling class remain unscathed by this. Workers classified as essential are not guaranteed safety, hazard pay, or any kind of relief during this period. And the burden of this crisis, unsurprisingly, falls on the backs of the workers who run this country. This week I saw a headline that said, quote, "Coronavirus has secured Jeff Bezos as the world's richest person," end quote. Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, who didn't pay any US taxes despite hoarding obscene amounts of wealth, secures this title as workers of Amazon walk off the job, demanding better treatment, pay, and protection. And we know that Bezos has more than enough wealth to provide for the demands of the workers. And in fact, the wealth that Bezos is hoarding doesn't even really belong to him. It belongs to the workers who run Amazon, who created the wealth. And so why are the working people dealt with a measly one-time $1,200 check if you even qualify, when a small percentage of Bezos's wealth alone could provide adequate relief for the people? We live in the richest country in the world, home to the richest man in the world, and we should be more than equipped to deal with this crisis. Yet, China is to blame. So it bears repeating that COVID-19, again, was first diagnosed in December of 2019, and instead of preparing for this crisis, the government and corporate-owned media callously capitalized on this crisis to slander China by chalking up their measures as draconian and that this was the fault of the Communist Party. The consequences of the shallow and racist association between the virus and China as a country had its impact on the Chinese community around the world, especially in the US, almost immediately. As of now, over 1,000 cases of anti-Asian hate crimes have been documented since March, and those are only cases that are documented. And this is a direct result of the propaganda campaign, as well as the president's racist references to the coronavirus. Asian Americans here at home and the people of China will pay the price of this propaganda machine, driving further war and demonization. So we reject the anti-Asian racism that is rapidly increasing. And the answer to the crisis is not by scapegoating a single country or a single group of people. The answer is to hold the US government's feet to the fire and demand what is rightfully ours: the right to housing, healthcare, employment. And during this time when we need to quarantine and social distance, we demand the right to adequate relief until this is over. And on Wednesday of this week, the Washington Post reported that actually the first recorded US COVID-19 death didn't occur in Seattle late February, but now occurred as early February in California, according to autopsies done by medical examiners. This means that many, many more deaths and exposures caused by COVID-19 took place earlier undetected without any proper protection or prevention of spread. The virus may have spread in the US undetected as early as January, while the government did nothing but sit on their hands and point fingers at China. And now that the US has become the leading nation with the most number of cases, with so many more people going untested, why did the US government spend all of its time inciting hate against China and the Chinese people instead of preparing for this crisis? And both Trump and Biden, who, Biden is now the presumptive presidential nominee for the Democratic Party, they're not competing with each other about who can best handle the COVID-19 crisis, but rather who is tougher on China. That's what they're competing about. And while the US continues to hit record highs of cases and deaths, and while workers who are deemed essential are forced to work without decent conditions, and while states within this country are still debating about their so-called freedoms and sheltering in place, the two people who are on the ticket to lead this country are instead deeming China the number one threat of this country, when the actual threat is the war-driven imperialist system itself that has no regard for humanity whatsoever. So we in the Party for Socialism and Liberation reject the rising anti-China sentiment in the US and the propaganda drive towards war. The US is threatened by China's development and rise as a global leader in the modern period, which is challenging the US empire and its domination of the world. China has successfully defeated the virus in its own country, and after months of rigorous quarantine and testing, many cities across China are now reopening. We actually have a lot to learn from China. China, along with Cuba, have provided aid to dozens of countries around the world by sending personal protective equipment and medical expertise on COVID-19. While the US government is unwilling to work collaboratively with China to defeat the crisis, it's only ramping up COVID-19 scapegoating of China. Again, why is this the priority of our leaders? So our fight back must hold the leaders of this country responsible for this growing crisis that currently seems to have no end in sight. It is not the Chinese government that's responsible for our for-profit healthcare system, nor is it responsible for the unprecedented economic crisis of unemployment or housing. It's not the Chinese government that's responsible for the lack of preparedness that our country has displayed. So again, our fight back really needs to expose the US government, including its shameless and reckless drive towards war. The US government has shown even during this crisis that the #1 priority is to further its imperialistic war drive, not only with China, but Iran as well, right? This week, Trump just tweeted about shooting and destroying Iranian warships. So our demands must include an end to US war propaganda and aggression. And while the government gives us crumbs they call relief for the working people of the US, the military budget remains afloat to continue its war exercises. The taxes we pay in this country, which should be used to deal with the crisis at home, not to fund war. So the job of corporate-owned media really is to sell and justify escalation of war. And a recent poll that I saw showed that upward of 70% of Americans really do believe that China is to blame for this crisis. We are in a situation where any neutral or any positive comment made about China or its handling of the crisis can discredit you. And the further this rhetoric remains unchallenged, the closer we will get to destructive global war. And without a firm resistance against this rhetoric, war seems more and more inevitable. And this is why we in the PSL stand firmly against the US imperialist agenda. Another part of our fight back also must be to unapologetically reject racist attitudes associating COVID-19 with Asian people. When we see racist attacks, we must stand up and expose these sort of crimes. When we hear derogatory comments, no matter how innocent, made about Chinese people and China in general, we should reject and challenge those narratives, while also exposing the fact that the US government is much more interested in furthering its war aggression rather than providing for the very pressing needs of the people. We literally have nothing to gain from war with China or from the racist campaign waged against Asian people. So we have a deep responsibility as a working class here in the belly of the beast to resist the racist US war drive and to struggle and fight for the needs of the people. And in order for our fight back to win, we must embody internationalism. After all, this pandemic is a global one. Only cooperation and global solidarity can we guarantee an end to this crisis. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheila, for that presentation. Now I would like to introduce our next and final speaker, Ben Becker. Ben is a member of the PSL's Central Committee. He is joining us from New York. Welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you for everyone tuning in. Good evening, good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm going to be speaking a little bit about the April 25th National Mobilization, which is focusing around car caravans in as many as 40 cities, perhaps more, that will be demanding, first and foremost, the cancellation of the rent. Cancellation of the rent, not just a moratorium on evictions. In other words, saying it so your landlord can't evict a tenant who doesn't pay for a few months, but then the rent continues to accumulate over those 3 months, but that all of the rental payments during the duration of this pandemic must be canceled, must be waived. And not just for renters, but also for homeowners. Their mortgage payments should just be canceled during the duration of this pandemic. And also for small businesses and small landlords, because small landlords, even though they're landlords, many of them can't go 3 or 4 months without any income. And if they don't pay their mortgage, that means their tenants are also going to be evicted when that home is foreclosed. So we're focusing on the issue of housing because this is the urgent issue among many other urgent issues, with the rent and the mortgages being due in just another week. But this is only one part of our overall program, and I want to just speak a little bit about what that program is and why we think it's so urgent that people take part in these protests on Saturday, April 25th. Now, I want to say from the beginning, it's going to be nothing like the right-wing reactionary protests that are refusing to observe social distancing guidelines. For our part, we believe that it's absolutely necessary that people observe these guidelines. It's one of the reasons why we're doing it in cars. We'll be masked up as well. But there's nothing that stops us, and there's no public health risk from going in your car, hanging a banner out of the window or on the side of the car that says cancel the rents. And we have a website, canceltherents.org, where you can find more information about that. I want to just share a little bit about what the thinking was in launching this initiative. We believe that the United States of America is entering a new era of class struggle, a new era of class struggle that will last from far beyond when this pandemic ends. Of course, the class war is always ongoing. It's the difference is that it's usually just the working class that's taking all the licks, while the capitalist class is doing all the beating. We believe a new period of class struggle is on the verge of opening up, and you can already see it with the heroic struggles of Amazon workers, of grocery workers, the wildcat strikes that are taking place. And in fact, this is just the tip of the iceberg for what is to come. Right now, people are in crisis just thinking about how are they going to live? How are they going to survive? I'm speaking to you from Elmhurst, Queens. I looked up the data last night, and the infection rate of just confirmed cases is now 1 in every 45 people who live in Elmhurst, Queens. There's 2,200 confirmed cases in a zip code that has 100,000 people. And in Corona, Queens, right next door, it's even higher. This is 4 times the peak rate of Wuhan in China, which was 1 in 200. That's what's happening right outside my window right here, a huge public health crisis. It'll be a miracle if we get through this video without a siren going by. And so people, of course, are thinking first and foremost about their health. But the public health crisis isn't in and of itself a reflection of a class war. I'm here in Elmhurst, where the hospitals and the clinics have long been underserviced. They've always been at capacity, where the community here is largely immigrant workers who had no access to preventive care, no access to insurance. And so for a long time, Elmhurst Hospital has been a very difficult place to go. And now it's completely stretched past capacity. There's a huge housing crisis in this neighborhood, which you don't see when you walk outside. You don't see it because immigrant communities are largely living 5, 6, 7 to an apartment that's supposed to have 2 or 3 people. Living rooms are being rented out for whole families to stay in. So how in a community like that, in these kind of social conditions, is it possible to practice social distancing? It's not possible. So the housing crisis and the public health crisis are going together. And if people end up evicted or foreclosed during this crisis, that means they're going to be outside, and that means they're going to be at risk. The unemployment crisis has already reached something that has not been seen since the Great Depression. 22 million people in the last 4 weeks have filed for unemployment insurance. That's not even the real number, because there's lots of people who are between jobs who are not going to be able to apply, people without papers who are not going to be able to apply, people who had stopped looking for work from before this who are not going to be able to apply, the prisoners who are not going to be able to apply, of course, who are not counted in the unemployed. But the real number of people who are out of work and the real number of families that are hurting is way beyond 22 million. And I think this week it's going to be even higher, because how long can a small business, or even a big business in some cases, how long can they hold out with no income coming in before they start letting go of more people? And this crisis of 22 million, we're starting to see the glimmers of it. We're starting to see the glimpses of it in the food pantries, the food lines, the people waiting 4 to 6 hours from their cars in long lines stretching many blocks in San Antonio, in Detroit, in Minneapolis, all over the place, waiting for 1 box of food or 1 bag of food. And to think that when those workers, and whether they have a job right now or not, they're workers, when those workers go home, they have to essentially be rationing every single meal. And they're not working, and it's not because they've chosen to not work. They're not working because the government has told them, for public health reasons, they have to stay home. So just wrap your head around the absurdity of this, that the government is telling people they cannot work, they should not work, telling businesses to close down, and yet all of your bills are still gonna be due? Doesn't the government have an obligation, if it's going to shut down basically the whole economy, to make sure that people are not going hungry, are not gonna be evicted at the end of this? This is a very elementary and simple program that we're putting forward here of canceling the rents and canceling the mortgages. Many countries have done it. And it's not just the socialist countries. The socialist countries, in a lot of ways, are doing the best, but even the capitalist countries are canceling the rents, canceling credit card payments, canceling payments on utilities, on electricity, on water, on internet. All these things can easily be waived and canceled. They should be. It's the only fair and just thing to do. The reason they haven't been is not really a feature of ineptitude or inaction, although that is part of it. It's a part of a class war, because the government is acting very quickly and very successfully, we should say, to hand over trillions of dollars of money to the banks and the corporations. They've handed over in the first bailout $6 trillion, handed it over to back up oil companies, airlines, banks, hedge funds, insurance companies, to make sure that those companies and the executives who run them, they don't go belly up. But the working class is waiting. Many of us are still waiting for the $1,200 check, which is starting to feel like an illusion. Others who have gotten the check have already spent the check on those bills that I just mentioned. The unemployment insurance, how many of those 22 million have been able to really even get through or started to get their checks? How many other people have got a website down kind of error? I mean, the whole unemployment system is broken. The small businesses, they haven't been able to get, a lot of them haven't been able to get their loans either. So they're inventing another bailout. But if the second bailout's anything like the first bailout, that's really going to be a scam. The airline industries applied for and got billions of dollars under the Small Business Administration. Delta and American Airlines are now small businesses. So this is really the class character of the government has just been exposed, unmasked in a matter of months. Because a lot of those 22 million workers a month ago, they might have been doing okay. And the media and the politicians are all saying, well, we all have to stick together. We all have to tighten our belts. We all have to, come together as a country to get through this crisis. We're all going to, we're all suffering. We're all anxious. But no, we're not all anxious the same way. Why does the working class always have to wait? That's the real message of our April 25th demonstration. And our answer is that the working class doesn't have to wait. The working class can start taking action now. It's not sufficient to wait for some progressive legislators in the Democratic Party to sort of come in and create these emergency programs that we need. Some of them have even put forward bills similar to what we're saying, like canceling the rent. Representative Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. Now, if these bills were to actually become law, this would be a huge advance. But we have to really ask, and I think it's worth asking, why isn't that section of the Democratic Party putting a stop to these bailout bills and using their leverage and saying, we will not let this pass unless it includes something for the working class? It's not enough to just write a nice bill and put it on your website. If you're not actually going to fight for it in Washington, then you're really just carrying out an act of deception, making us hope that something passes when it never will. So it's important that the working class, which has long been under attack, the vast majority of which, 150 million people were in or near poverty before this crisis. They couldn't survive not receiving their paychecks for 2 cycles. They would go broke. They would be in poverty. Well, now those 2 pay cycles have passed. It's been a month since the shutdown, and now that crisis is really upon us. So it's extremely important that the social force of the working class, without which nothing could move in this society, start to be felt. The farm workers, especially the workers who don't have papers, they've been bullied and beaten down, intimidated, mocked, ridiculed, scapegoated for so long. Now all of society is starting to see just how essential those workers are. And once they begin to mobilize their social force, then the things that seemed impossible just a month ago or 2 months ago, like full legalization for all those workers, can become possible. And the same is true for the canceling the rent. The same is true for Medicare for all. The same is true for an immediate subsidy of $2 or $3 or even more $1,000 per month to every family so they can survive. All these things can be made possible, but we have to fight. The working class's power has to be felt. So whether April 25th, it's not all going to happen in one day. We don't think tens of millions are going to come out on April 25th, but we want to get this process going. We want to get this struggle going, because as organizers and revolutionaries, we're not just trying to be spectators of a social process. We have to look at what's going on and anticipate what's coming next, and then try to intervene in it with tactics and strategies that bring to bear the full power of the working class so that we can advance the struggle, not just so we can beat back the attacks of the banks or the corporations or the employers or the governments that are denying paid sick leave, but so that we can actually win concessions from the ruling class. I want to also note one other thing, which might seem like a separate issue, but it's really not a separate issue. Right now, the US government is carrying out, as Sheila said, I'm so happy that Sheila made that presentation about the scapegoating of China. Right now, Donald Trump is threatening to bomb, is telling the US military that it should destroy Iranian boats off the coast of Iran, we should add, and potentially bring the country to a new war in the middle of this pandemic. Now, just recall, only 3-4 months ago, we were within a whisker's length of a full-blown war with Iran when Trump assassinated the top general of Iran. Now he's also deploying warships to the eastern coast of Venezuela, threatening that country with a full-scale invasion in the middle of a pandemic. We have to see these things as interconnected and part of our same struggle. While we're building a socialist and a working class movement that can meet the urgency of this moment, we're also going to do so with an internationalist and anti-war perspective. Because honestly, what is the purpose of these wars, these interventions, these belligerent threats? It's all a form of distraction and deception. It's all a way of keeping us from fighting our own ruling class by seeing the enemy as some other country. It's the sort of classic, look over here while we thieve you, while we steal from you, while we take money out of your pockets, while we funnel billions to the banks and corporations. Go look at Iran, Venezuela, China. Those are your real enemies. That's who's to blame for the situation you're in. So we can't really build a class conscious movement in this country unless we're also raising these issues. And these wars and these sanctions are already killing people in those countries. Just to think about the Iranian or Venezuelan people in government, that they're already dealing with a pandemic and now they have to divert resources to think about a full-scale invasion from the largest military in the world. It's a true crime. And of course, the Democrats, again, are not calling this out, not calling for a full elimination of the sanctions, not calling out these war threats. So both parties are really functioning together to carry out a deception, to carry out a policy that can only be characterized as criminal against the working class of the United States and the peoples of the world. And that's the type of politics that we're going to be raising on April 25th. And we hope that you join us. And we hope that you don't just join us on that day, but become an organizer. This is the time where we need organizers. Every person who's devoted to advancing the struggle should be able to reach 5 or 10 other people right now. You know, you might have thought if you had radical ideas, you were by yourself. But right now, reality itself has become very radical. And a new era of class struggle is opening. And it's time for the radicals to stand up, speak out, and organize as we never have before. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben, so much for that presentation. As Ben mentioned, you can visit canceltherents.org to find out what's happening in your area and to get involved. Now we're going to move into our Q&A segment. We have a few questions for the presenters. This first one is for Ben. April 25th is a critical action to cancel the rents, and you have detailed its important demands and why we're making them. The news and President Trump have recently given a lot of notice to the reactionary protests against the stay-at-home orders. For the general public, how can they clearly understand the difference between the April 25th car caravan to cancel the rents and the reactionary protests?
Yes, I think that's an important question. And the truth is that our protests could not be more different. What we are, first of all, going to observe social distancing guidelines with our protests. We are not against the shelter-in-place orders. We are saying that if the shelter-in-place orders are in place, then the government has an obligation to not push that crisis, the cost of that crisis, onto the working class. That's why the payments have to be waived. And when you look at those right-wing protests, they were never raising the programs of the working class, which is to cancel the mortgages, cancel the rents, and the whole range of other things that can be done for the government to alleviate the suffering and alleviate the anxiety that the working class is facing right now. What those protests represented, in addition to sort of denialism, and there was a huge presence of right-wing, anti-Semitic, fascistic, chauvinistic sort of presence in those protests. What they represented was really a faction of small business owners, and I think they were really doing the bidding of a section of the ruling class, the big corporations and the governors who want to reopen the country very quickly, damn the consequences. Those who are saying, well, it's only a 2 or 3% difference maybe if we open up in terms of fatality, if we reopen the schools. Well, 2 or 3% of hundreds of millions of people is millions of people dying so that they can get back to making their money. I think a lot of those protesters were small businesses who are eager for their workers to come back, or eager for their workers to come back and start making them money. So we're not denying at all the public health emergency. But I will say this, of course, insofar as the government does not provide the program for the working class, in other words, the alleviation of the rent and the other bills, insofar as food is not a right, insofar as healthcare is not a right, more and more people are going to be susceptible to those right-wing arguments that says, well, if you're going to leave us to starve, or you're going to leave us to wipe out our savings, then we'd rather risk our health and go back out into the streets. That's going to have more and more influence among the population, including not only the traditional far-right sectors. I think some of the people who protested probably already were up against it in that sense. So the fact that the Democratic Party in particular has not fought for, and it's very telling that they have not fought for it, have not fought for the working class program in this crisis. It leaves more people to be drawn in by right-wing arguments from Donald Trump, and I think these sort of big corporate giants behind him that are really eager to reopen the economy, no matter who's going to die, because of course it's not going to be them who die. It's not going to be them riding mass transit. It's not going to be them cleaning people's homes. It's not going to be them working at the grocery stores or in the fields. So I think that it's very important that we have to have a left-wing alternative, a socialist and working class alternative that represents a struggle against the government. If we don't have that working class struggle alternative, people are going to be drawn into a far right and really capitalist struggle against the government. People who are struggling against the government for all the wrong reasons. Makes April 25th all the more important that we start to be that other pole in society, that people can say, okay, that they actually have a program that can solve this situation and won't put me at public in any sort of great risk. So that's the short answer to it. We're also going to be advancing many of the demands of our class: full rights for immigrants, the release of prisoners, to stop the scapegoating. We have a message based on unity across nationality and background. A lot of those protests were manifesting outright chauvinism in many different forms.
Thank you so much, Ben, for that response. So this next question we have is for Sheila. Sheila, what organizing have you seen either from the Chinese community or more generally from the anti-war and anti-imperialist movement in opposing the rising anti-Chinese racism you talked about?
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Ben, for that really, really great talk. Yeah, so there has been organizing around this issue, especially among the Chinese community. Before the shutdown took place, and actually as early as January, when the growing the growing anti-Chinese racism was taking place in the US against Chinese people, Chinatowns around the country experienced a dramatic drop in business. And this was not due to the coronavirus, it was due to the racism, ensued by the rhetoric around the coronavirus. And, at the same time, we saw countless recordings and attacks of Chinese and Asian people, spiking all over the country. But again, before the crisis really was widespread in the US, Chinese communities around the country, and specifically in San Francisco, mobilized a massive demonstration in Chinatown, San Francisco, both in solidarity with the people of Wuhan and with the Chinese community to defeat, these racist rumors that claim that the virus was a Chinese problem, right? And we know that the coronavirus is a public health issue. And so a lot of the Chinese community in San Francisco, from all different classes, joined together to have this rally of like over 1,000 people of Chinese Americans. And this is kind of amazing. And as someone who grew up in the Chinese community in San Francisco, it's something that I had never seen before. There were a sea of signs that read, "Fight the disease, not the people." And so, I wanted to highlight, like, these folks were not just fighting the racism against their community, against our community, but also the deepening China bashing. People are recognizing how the media is hyper-focused on China rather than actually addressing the crisis here at home. So, I think even previously when I talked about how the anti-China propaganda campaign is effective, which it is, and there are a ton of Americans who really believe that China is to blame for this, I think we can all agree that most people in the US do not want war with China, and war with China would be catastrophic. War, actually, as Ben mentioned, war in the middle of a pandemic especially is an issue, and we need to fight against that. And so, we in the PSL, we've always organized anti-war campaigns against US aggression, often to fight against a very powerful, well-funded propaganda machine. But the truth is, the anti-China propaganda is really stronger than ever. And if we do not intervene, especially as anti-imperialists, as revolutionaries against the China bashing, then we are seeing us inch closer towards war in this crisis. And like Ben mentioned, we have to see these issues as interconnected, right? China and Iran are not our enemies. The top elites of this country are our enemies. The people who, can't even meet our basic demands that every other country, has been able to provide for their people. And so, the demands that we're making for the April 25th caravan protests are basic. They're simple demands, that are easily provided, could be provided for us, given that we are in the richest country in the world. So our job is really to raise consciousness among our class to see past the scapegoating of China, because really no one will win if this war persists. No one. So people are organizing, especially in the Chinese community, in whatever means is possible during this period. We all have to shelter in place and we can't gather physically, but people are organizing, people are talking about this. I'm seeing a lot of people countering the anti-China stuff on social media, which is important, but I think our role really is not only to show solidarity with the Chinese community and with China, but also to grow consciousness of the working class here. I think that if we can begin to start poking at, exposing the anti-China stuff, like, we could go a long way with mounting a really successful campaign against war with China.
Sheila, thank you so much for that response. And I want to thank each of our presenters again for joining our program today and sharing with our viewers. Before we end the webinar event, I want to remind everyone that you can follow the PSL on social media and on Twitter at PSL Web, and you can read our analysis by visiting liberationnews.org. This Saturday, again, on April 25th, the PSL is calling a national day of car protests to demand a national cancellation of all rents, mortgages for homeowners, small landowners, and small businesses for the duration of the pandemic. You can visit canceltherents.org to find out what's happening in your area and to get involved. Thank you all for tuning in and joining us. Thinking about socialism is good. Thinking and talking about socialism is better. But building a socialist party is best of all. Stay safe.